I was elected by the Australian people as Prime Minister of this country to bring back a fair go for all Australians. And I have given my absolute best to do that.
As you would probably be aware by now, Kevin Rudd has been elected as leader of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party. I congratulate Mr Rudd on his election. I have written to the Governor-General asking her to commission Rudd as Prime Minister of Australia.
A short time ago, I telephoned Tony Abbott to concede defeat at these national elections.
This is not an easy day for many people in this building. Leadership changes are never easy for our country. My pledge today is to make this change as easy as I can.
There was a determined insurgency from a number of people, really to bring, if not bring down the government, certainly bring down my Prime Ministership.
Mr Morrison, I invite you to take and subscribe the oath of office as Prime Minister of Australia.
Gentlemen, this is Democracy Manifest.
You see this sort of comment a lot. Something like, "He's got my vote for Prime Minister." All of these comments are specifically from articles regarding Queensland MP Fraser Anning's appearance at an actual neo-Nazi rally. In what should come as a surprise to no one, white nationalists have a very poor understanding regarding how our system of government is formed. Australian citizens do not vote for Prime Minister. We elect a local member of Parliament. Then, the political party or coalition of parties who has a majority in the lower house of Parliament forms government. The leader of that party, as elected by that party itself, becomes Prime Minister. You'd think people would be well versed in how the Westminster system works, with how much practical education we've gotten in it in recent years. In the past 12 years, Australia has had 6 governments under 5 Prime Ministers. Rudd, Gillard, Rudd again, Abbott, Turnbull, and now Morrison. The only one of these Prime Ministers to lose their office through an election was Rudd, the second time around. Each of the others was replaced via a leadership spill within their own party. According to former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, all this has led to Australia being described as the coup capital of the world, or alternatively, the Italy of the South. A necessary burn on Italy. So what is all this talk of a coup capital? Why have our Prime Ministers kept getting replaced? And are they really more disposable now than they've been at any point in our history? Part 1. The modern Prime Minister. If the position of Prime Minister is now seen as an unstable position, we need to look backwards to understand why it was once seen as stable. From a period of 1975 to 2007, Australia had just 4 Prime Ministers. Now 1975 is a nice starting point, since that's when Governor-General John Kerr replaced then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam with Malcolm Fraser, in what could be best described as a pseudo-constitutional kerfuffle. I don't want to get too far into the dismissal here, but it's fair to say that this is when the position of the Australian Prime Minister was at its least stable. Although Fraser's rise to power was a massive destabilising force for the office of PM, he would go on to hold the position for 8 years, winning 3 elections along the way. Then, in 1983, Labor, under the leadership of Bob Hawke, won. Though Labor would stay in power for 13 years, Hawke would be ousted as PM after 8 years on the job, when his deputy, Paul Keating, believed he reneged on a promise to let Keating run as party leader in the next election. The Hawke-Keating power struggle was ugly, and quite similar to any of our so-called modern coups. But it was the only one to happen between 1975 and 2007. Keating would hold the position for 5 years until the 1996 election, when John Howard's government was elected. Under Howard's leadership, the coalition held power for 11 years, all of them with Howard as PM. He would eventually lose to Kevin Rudd in the 2007 election, marking the end of the stable Australian Prime Minister. So, the 4 post-dismissal PMs stayed in office for a combined 32 years. In that same time span, the United States had 5 presidents. In other Westminster systems, the UK had 4 PMs, while New Zealand had 5 and India 9. In particular, John Howard did more than anyone to make the position appear stable. Howard's 11 years in the job is the second longest stint of any PM. Despite any opinions you or I might have on the man, he did radiate confidence. During those 11 years, he was never formally challenged for the leadership of the Liberal Party. We also saw him operating on the world stage more than any of his predecessors, particularly thanks to his close personal friendship with George W. Bush. Seeing the two of them together looked like two presidents. Look at them, hanging out, planning war crimes together. So, what changed? Part 2. We need to talk about Kevin 07. In her book, Political Branding Strategies, Campaigning and Governing in Australian Politics, Dr. Loran Downer writes, "In brand-saturated Western societies, parties and politicians increasingly treat themselves as brands. In Australia, this reached its zenith in 2007 with Labor's electoral campaign. The simple slogan behind it all was Kevin 07. Kevin 07 was everywhere. Shirts, bumper stickers, mugs, and particularly all over the internet. Now, it's unusual in the history of Australian politics for the party leader to have such precedence in the campaign. While the populace has always been aware that the end result of a federal election will be to install one of the leaders as Prime Minister, there's usually a level of coyness to the slogans used throughout Australian history. For instance, the 1977 Liberal slogan was "Liberal, doing the job." And in 1993, Labor used "Australia deserves better." In fact, pre-Kevin 07, the only official campaign slogans that mentioned the leaders by name were twice by Labor in the 1980s. Once, in 1983, with the slogan "Bob Hawke, bringing Australia together," and then again in 1990 with "Bob Hawke for Australia's future." Now, these slogans are far from the norm, and neither are anywhere near as direct as Kevin 07. The message was simple: elect Kevin Rudd in 07. The slogan wasn't "elect your local Labor candidate in the hopes that Labor gains a majority in the lower house of Parliament so that they might form a government with Kevin Rudd appointed as Prime Minister 07. It's a bit wordy, I guess. Anyway, Rudd's personal brand included many points of difference from the then PM John Howard. Rudd would be pro-tackling climate change, pro-worker, pro-family, etc., etc. But at the same time, he branded himself as an economic conservative who would continue the stable running of Australia. Now, Rudd's campaign got a whole generation of people into politics. Entire swaths of young people who'd never cared about politics were drawn in. He was sold to young people as a revolutionary change, particularly on how he would combat global warming. At the same time, he was sold to an older audience as a conservative continuation of the Howard years. And at the centre of it all was Kevin 07 himself, who was absolutely saturating the electorate with media appearances, with a particular focus on emerging online media. Then, on election night, Labor swept into power. Kevin Rudd was set to become our next Prime Minister, with no downfall in sight. Part 3. Kevin's downfall. It was smooth sailing for a little while. Rudd quickly fulfilled campaign promises to sign the Kyoto Protocol and apologise to the stolen generation. Then the global financial crisis came along and got in the way. To Rudd and his government's credit, the combination of government spending and stimulus packages helped keep Australia out of recession during the entire GFC, something which only a few countries across the world managed. Now, some people debate how much of this was due to the mining boom compared to Rudd's management, but at least some credit is due there. The shine started really coming off the apple when Rudd started taking hits for the poorly regulated home insulation scheme, which cost 4 people their lives. The opposition also jumped on the government's spending habits, chastising them for taking the nation from surplus to deficit while claiming to be an economic conservative. Then came Rudd's era-defining backflip on climate change. Rudd famously called climate change
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
Twice in 2009, Labor tried to pass the emissions trading scheme, known derisively as the carbon tax, but failed twice to get it passed the Senate. This could have triggered a double dissolution, where Rudd could have taken the issue to election. But he didn't. Instead, in April of 2010, he announced they were delaying the issue until 2013, and it was a big disappointment. New opposition leader and climate change denialist Tony Abbott was able to campaign against the scheme effectively, calling it a great big new tax on everything. Which is a bit rich coming from the party that introduced the GST. Just saying. Anyway, the backdown on climate change was a huge blow to the personal credibility of Kevin Rudd. He went from a +9 preference to a -11 in the very next poll. That same poll showed ALP first preference voting drop from 43% to 35%, with one pundit famously describing it as if Labour had lost 1 million voters in 1 week. This was all during an election year, and Kevin 07 looked cooked. So, Labour Party backers stepped in. Part 4. Julia's Go. The language around Gillard's rise to power was a little bit hyperbolic. Public reaction mirrored this sentiment. To quote the now disgraced former Labour Senator Sam Dastyari, "In one night we took this amazing talented politician in Julia Gillard, and we took her from a lady-in-waiting and made her Lady Macbeth, and she never recovered from it." Anyway, Gillard's net satisfaction rating before she became Prime Minister was at +19%. It's hard to remember now, but people really liked her. One grueling election campaign later, and this was no longer the case. The election campaign featured damaging leaks from an unknown pro-Rudd source, several unforced errors on Julia's part, and the standard misogyny one sadly expects from the Australian press and public. Gillard's Labour Party limped back into power as a minority government, with only 72 of the needed 76 seats for a majority. In order to get any legislation through the House of Representatives, she needed approval of at least 4 independent or minor party MPs. On top of all this was that none of the Rudd government's problems had gone away. Climate change was still at the forefront of many people's minds. Ironically, Gillard promised not to install an emissions trading scheme during the campaign. But, as part of her negotiations with the Greens to form a minority government, she reneged on this promise. So, while Rudd promised to, then chickened out, Gillard promised not to, then gritted her teeth and did it. And she was crucified for it. Like Rudd, her approval ratings took a massive hit, and she wasn't helped by the constant leadership stress placed on her by Rudd and his remaining allies. Eventually it all became too much to bear, and after a couple of false starts, the Labour Party once again changed leaders in an election year, with Rudd returning to the top job. Kevin Rudd's second stint as Prime Minister was less to run a functioning government, and more to quote-unquote save the furniture in the 2013 election. Labour campaign coordinator George Wright claimed after the election that internal pre-Rudd polling showed Labour gaining only 30 seats in the lower house, and that since they ended up with 55, they should have been happy. I personally find that pretty hard to believe, since the Labour Party hadn't suffered that low of a seat count since before World War II. Nevertheless, the Rudd bump helped justify the replacement of Julia Gillard, much in the same way that the Gillard bump helped justify the replacement of Rudd 3 years prior. God, that was an exhausting time in Australian politics. The opposition, who so often operated from the moral high ground when it came to leadership changes, was now in power. Long may they reign. The only problem was... Part 5. Tony Abbott's a huge fucking moron. Now, I could give you a detailed breakdown on Tony Abbott's failings as a politician, a leader, hell, as a human being. But we all know you're watching this for the onion clip. Look at him, eating that raw onion. He thinks he's people. Can't say I'm not relatable now. I'm fair dinkum, mate. Moron. Tony Abbott is about as bright as the average koala. He's a moron of Shakespearean proportions, an auteur of fuck-ups. Of course, the biggest failing in the eyes of his party was that he steadily became an unpopular moron. When he entered government, the News poll two-party preferred polling had the Liberals with a 56-44 lead over Labour. This was on the 27th of October 2013. By the 8th of December 2013, just 6 weeks later, Labour was back ahead 52-48. And, apart from one brief 51-49 reprieve in April of 2014, Tony Abbott's government would never again lead in the two-party preferred polling. By the end of Abbott's turn in the PM seat, he had just a 24% approval rating. Funnily enough, he still thinks he could be Prime Minister again one day. When Malcolm Turnbull challenged for the leadership in 2015, he specifically pointed to the 30 consecutive lost polls as a reason for change. Remember that number, it comes up again later. Anyway, he won the leadership spill 55-44 and became Australia's newest Prime Minister. Part 6. How the Turnbull tables Turnbull. While he was a much more refined and controlled media presence than Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull never seemed to have much of an ideology. He led the coalition to a skin-of-their-teeth victory in the 2016 election. He wanted to appear as a balanced, centrist leader, but still had to bend backwards to the far-right faction of the coalition, and the same-sex marriage plebiscite is a perfect example of this. Turnbull had been in favour of gay marriage in Australia dating back to at least 2012. By 2016, the issue had broad public support, as well as a clear majority in both houses of parliament. At this point, Malcolm was the one person in Australia who had the power to ensure its passage through parliament. But Turnbull still feared the anti-gay, hard-right faction of his own party. He first promised a compulsory plebiscite on gay marriage as a compromise. A plebiscite is just a large-scale formal poll, asking the country a yes or no question regarding if the marriage laws should change to include same-sex couples. It's like a referendum, except it has no official power behind it whatsoever. But the compulsory plebiscite motion was defeated in the Senate. So the government went around Parliament entirely and instead ordered a non-binding postal survey on the issue. So the survey was held instead. It was costly, divisive, and ended exactly how we all knew it would end, with Australia voting yes by a large margin. By the way, although the widely reported budget of the survey was $122 million, it only ended up wasting $80.5 million. Liberals, the party of sound financial management. The whole thing was pathetic on Turnbull's end. He was so afraid of the far right wing of his own party that he didn't make an obvious middle-of-the-road political move with broad public support that he himself claimed to believe in. This would have been an easy path to a legacy for him. Like how we still say about John Howard. Well, at least he changed the gun laws. Of course, Howard has a large and mixed legacy apart from that. But at the end of the day, most Australians are still thankful for the law changes that came around after the Port Arthur massacre. Turnbull could have had the same thing. Well, sure, he was a bit of a useless wanker, but at least he got gay marriage passed. But he was too focused on keeping the job that he was barely even doing. And surprise, surprise, he couldn't satisfy the far-right faction of the Liberal Party because they hated him. But thanks to his attempts at capitulation towards them, he never satisfied the rest of Australia either. Anyway, after he lost 30 consecutive news polls of his own, the knives came out. Part 7. Who the fuck is Scott Morrison? We're almost done. Scott Morrison's stumble into power came about in August of 2018, after notorious human rights abuser and husk of a man, Peter Dutton, challenged Malcolm Turnbull for the leadership. Dutton failed, but it was clear that Turnbull had lost control of the party, so Turnbull resigned. Morrison stepped up to the plate to challenge Dutton as a more moderate alternative. Morrison, of course, being a slightly less notorious abuser of human rights. If there's one thing we've learned in the past 6 months or so, it's that Scott Morrison isn't very good at being Prime Minister. He's just sort of come off as a less aggressive version of Tony Abbott. Now, people will always point to his weird Captain Cook fetish as the defining point of Morrison being a wanker. But for me, it will always be his attempt to move our embassy in Israel. In May of 2018, Donald Trump moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, becoming the first nation in the world to do so, outside of Israel. See, Jerusalem has been under Israeli control since the end of the 1967 war, but East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank, and is internationally recognized as Palestinian territory. As far as international law is concerned, only West Jerusalem is legally under Israeli control, whereas East Jerusalem is an illegal occupation. Israel disputes this, to put it lightly. After Malcolm Turnbull retired from Parliament, his seat went up for a by-election. His electorate in Wentworth has a relatively high Jewish population, around 12%. In October 2018, during the swing of this election campaign, Prime Minister Scott Morrison first raised the prospect of moving our embassy to Jerusalem as well. Now, at the time, the government was behind in the polls, and it was widely seen as a move to curry favour with the Jewish population of Wentworth in order to save a key seat for the government. Well, this last-ditch effort at pandering failed, and a safe Liberal seat fell to a non-Liberal candidate for the first time in 70 or so years. So this was a humiliating defeat for the government. But if Morrison had backed off from his idea to move the embassy, no one ever would have remembered it. Instead, in December of last year, apropos of nothing, Morrison announced that Australia would formally recognise West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, while keeping our embassy in Tel Aviv for the time being. So obviously this pissed off Palestinians and Muslim nations around the world, including a lot of Australia's very close trading partners. But the astonishing thing is, by only recognising West Jerusalem as the capital, Morrison pissed off Israel as well. Israel's Minister for Regional Cooperation let out this statement: "To our regret, within this positive news they made a mistake. There is no division between the east of the city and the west of the city. Jerusalem is one whole, united. Israel's control over it is eternal. Our sovereignty will not be partitioned nor undermined. And we hope Australia will soon find the way to fix the mistake it made." Now, I don't want to do a deep dive into the issues behind Israeli occupation, since I have a lot more common sense than Scott Morrison. So instead, I'll just say this. Do you know how hard it is to piss off Israel and Palestine on the same issue at the same time? It's almost never done. Short of dropping a naked Richard Dawkins into the Holy Land with a keg of Heineken, I don't know how else you would do it. But Scotty, after just 4 months on the job, he pulled it off. It's incredible. He's a fuck-up prodigy. And he's our Prime Minister. Part 8. Is this really all that weird? So, since Rudd was elected in 2007, we've had 6 different governments in 12 years. Has this rate of turnover ever been done before? Well, the first 12 years of Australian Federation, we had 8 governments. And in the following 12-year period, from 1913 to 1924, we had 6, including Billy Hughes acting as PM under 3 different political parties. If we were looking for a more modern period, the most turbulent eras would be from 1937 to 1949, where we had 7 governments, and again from 66 to 75, when we had 6. While these would both look comparable to modern levels of turnover, both of these streaks have significant asterisks next to their names, due to the deaths in office of both Joseph Lyons in 1939 and Harold Holt in 1967. So, apart from the first couple of decades of Australian Federation, or eras where Prime Ministers have died in office, this amount of change has been unprecedented. Now, while the replacing of our Prime Ministers looks a bit ridiculous overall, individually I think each has made sense. And while 6 governments in 12 years sounds like a quick turnaround, it certainly didn't feel like it at the time. I don't remember anyone at the end of Tony Abbott's term saying, "Boy, that went quickly," because it didn't. My point is, just because all this change has been unprecedented, doesn't mean it's been bad. Part 9. Why do we think it's so bad? My biggest problem isn't with the backstabbing or quote-unquote coup culture, but with how each of these leaders has helped perpetuate these changes as shocking and wrong. A great example comes from The Killing Season, ABC's 3-part documentary on the Rudd-Gillard era, which features extensive interviews with both of the former PMs. Rudd goes out of his way to continually refer to the spill as a coup, and even one time refers to Julia Gillard as an assassin. This lady, right here, as an assassin. Come now. Now, this annoys me because, by definition, a coup is an illegal attempt to replace a sitting government with another. Even if you think these changes were immoral, all of them were legal. You could argue that the PMs and the media have been using this term colloquially, but it still has negative connotations. And frankly, it's a little disrespectful to countries that have suffered actual destabilising coups d'etats. The thing is, politicians have attempted to mislead the public in a lot of ways about the role of the Prime Minister. I already spoke on the Kevin 07 campaign, and how it implied we were electing Kevin as the PM instead of electing a parliament. Well, in his farewell speech, his first one, he claimed he was elected Prime Minister by the Australian people, when of course only 50,000 people in the electorate of Griffith voted for him. You can say the Australian people elected his government, but we didn't elect Kevin Rudd. But it felt like we did, and Rudd happily stoked those feelings, and he's not the only one. My favourite account of a PM muddying the waters came from, who else? Tony Abbott. When Turnbull announced he was contesting the leadership, Abbott was quoted as saying, "The Prime Ministership of this country is not a prize or a plaything to be demanded. It should be something which is earned by a vote of the Australian people," which is a huge lie told by a huge liar. In fact, of our 30 Prime Ministers, in their 36 different stints as Prime Minister, only 11 of them rose to the office of PM through winning an election as the opposition leader. It is far more common for a PM to replace another due to backroom squabbling or some other reason. Hell, the first Australian Prime Minister to be replaced because of bad polling was our first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton. Although Edmund Barton officially retired so he could take a seat on the High Court, he only did so due to the pressure from Alfred Deakin and the rest of his party, who thought he was going to lose them the next election. If you want to read more about this, I recommend the excellent book, The Manner of Their Going, Prime Ministerial Exits from Lyne to Abbott, by Dr. Norman Abjörensen. I look forward to the inevitable second edition that will come out in a few years, adding the next 5 or so Prime Ministers to leave office. Now, how the media describes leadership changes affects how the public reacts to them. For instance, just a couple of weeks after Turnbull resigned, Emma Reynolds, writing for news.com.au, referred to it as a bloody leadership coup and a brutal removal from the Prime Ministership, when it was just a regular, albeit abnormally common, function of our democracy. All of this has had a huge effect on how Australians view the system. In 2007, 85.6% of people surveyed claimed to be satisfied with Australian democracy. We're now down to just 40% of people in 2018. In particular, just 31% of the population currently has trust in the institution of the federal government. The hyperbolic nature around the PM replacements has surely contributed to this. Part 10. In summary. So, we're headed towards another election, probably in April or May. If the polls are to be trusted, Labour will probably sweep into power, and opposition leader Bill Shorten will be appointed Prime Minister. The thing is, the latest Ipsos poll put Bill Shorten at just a 40% approval rate, with a 52% disapproval rate. Personally, I'm just shocked that 92% of Australians actually hold an opinion on Bill Shorten. Anyway, that's just his approval rating in opposition. It could, of course, go up. But if the rate holds, or more likely gets worse, we're probably just a couple of years away from Prime Minister Tanya Plibersek, or Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Could the lesson here be as simple as political parties should stop appointing unpopular leaders? Maybe. Now, I don't want this video to read as me arguing for constant changes in government. There are obvious downsides, especially since the media has such an outsized effect on how people view politicians, thereby affecting the opinions found in these polls. Just because someone's unpopular doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. But here's the question I want to raise to you. Considering the job they did, and how they were replaced, did any of this mob actually deserve a longer go? We are now living in a time of uncertainty, but a time of uncertainty is also a time of opportunity. People are widely dissatisfied with the current system of government. So why don't we start talking about changing the system of government? Should we have American-style primaries where party leaders are selected by popular vote? Should we just abolish the position of Prime Minister altogether and see how the system functions without one? Or should we just say fuck it and go full anarcho-syndicalist? You tell me. The media, and perhaps the parties themselves, are going to hype the upcoming election as Scott Morrison versus Bill Shorten. ScoMo versus the Big Short. But remember this, you are not voting for Prime Minister. You're voting for a member of a party, and it's the party who forms government who has control, not the current leader. So take the time, read up on each party, and really inform yourself on who you can trust. Then just vote Greens. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm going to be doing more political analysis in the run-up towards the next election, as well as my normal videos, focusing on niche aspects of culture and literature. If you want either or both of those things, hit the subscribe button. If you want more of my outsized political opinions, or the occasional photo of my cats, follow me on Twitter at HardcoreLion.